My name is Esmat Elhalaby. I'm currently working on a book project entitled Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine, India, and the Making of the Global South. So I was initially interested in the history of Arab thought in general, especially what's known as the Nahda, or the Arabic Renaissance of the 19th and early 20th century. And in looking at those materials, I started to realize that the presence of India in this work was being elided in the scholarship on the Nahda in general. In writing on the Nahda, the general orientation of the work is towards Europe. So the text of the Nahda is the Arab travelogue to Europe, the translation of European texts into Arabic, and the Middle East's location in Asia and the orientation of intellectuals towards Asia and travel in the Asian continent is generally disregarded. And so this doesn't mean those sources don't exist, but it didn't generally come into the historiography. So I started noticing the presence of India and writing about India and traveled to India and just followed those routes. One goal is certainly the question of retrieval. So there is this huge amount of material that hasn't been recognized in the scholarship. So it's a question of acquiring this material and recognizing the Indian presence in Arab thought. The second goal is the question of comparison and recognizing the relationship between Arab intellectual history in the modern period with intellectual history more generally in the 19th and 20th century, especially when it comes to the colonized world and Asia and Africa. So you see this initially in shared idioms in the historiography. For example, the Arab Renaissance or Arabic Renaissance and the Chinese Renaissance or the Bengali Renaissance. You'll find these things in the Chinese historiography or the South Asian historiography. So it's recognizing that actually there is a shared set of conditions, the rise of capitalism, colonialism, the emergence of print culture, the loss of authority on the part of certain ecclesiastical institutions, and a response to that on the part of intellectuals in these parts of the world. And so you will find shared sorts of work and recognizing it. The final goal, which really comes out of the accumulation of the material, the recognition of its global conditions, is the question of connections and connected history. And that this isn't simply these things are going on in particular regions or specific nations and are therefore part of regional historiographies or national historiographies, that actually the people we're talking about are traveling. They're coming to modernity, they're coming to anti-colonialism through their travels around the world. And in particular, I look at the travels of Arab intellectuals to India and Indian intellectuals in the Arab world or the Middle East. So this final point is sort of the meat of the project, and the most important part of it is tracking these transnational connections and recognizing that the history of nationalism, for example, is really a transnational history. It's one born out of precisely these kinds of travels or conferences or publications. Being at NYU Abu Dhabi has been incredibly helpful for this sort of research. It's, a few hours to Beirut and Cairo by plane, a few hours to Delhi or Lahore by plane. So the travel is much simpler, and you really have to travel to do this kind of work. This material isn't going to come to you. And the place of the Gulf is important in telling these histories because it's impossible to think about the history of the UAE without recognizing its intimate connection to South Asia and its people, its texts, the history of travel, and the history of British colonialism. The fellowship has a number of, gives you a number of important opportunities in terms of creating conversations around your work. For example, you're able to fund a workshop to bring scholars from the region, from other parts of the world, to discuss your own work and questions revolving around the kinds of research that you're doing. This is incredibly helpful, especially for early career scholars who aren't always given these sorts of opportunities to fly people in and really share their work at a high level. So I've just finished my PhD in history at Rice University just this last summer, and the fellowship has really given me the opportunity to go away and think about how I want my dissertation to look like in book form. So I've had the time and opportunity to write a book proposal, to speak to publishers about it, and really think about, in a rich intellectual space, what my book is going to do and who it's going to speak to and what kinds of questions I want to forefront that are distinct from the sorts of work I was doing while I was finishing my PhD. NYU Abu Dhabi has remarkable faculty resources, and the sheer amount of people working on this campus, on the Arab world, and on South Asia is incredible. So I've had wonderful opportunities to present my work, both formally and in informal discussions, and I've really been able to think about how my work connects to the region, but also to the very diverse kinds of work people are doing here, whether in history or in other fields related to my work. So, Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine, India, and the Making of the Global South tells the history of the twin partitions of British Mandate Palestine and British India in 1947-48 from the standpoint of their victims. It looks at how these partitions were intimately linked. And rather than looking at how they were linked in the annals of imperial administration, same British colonial administrators working to partition both India and Palestine, I look at how Arab and Indian intellectuals responded to this partition, compared these partitions to each other, and worked against them. I also look at the aftermath. How did these partitions affect the relationship between Arabs and South Asians in those decades after 47 and 48? So with the rise of non-alignment, third worldism, Afro-Asian movements in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, what did this particular space between South Asia and the Middle East come to mean for intellectuals who were attached to those various ideas and movements?